Hello, we are going to talk about deforestation for this video, and as you know, deforestation is when there is the cutting down of trees and vegetation in large areas of forest. Usually we link it to rainforest, but any forest that has been cut down in large amounts, we call that deforestation. Now there is a little bit of a problem with deforestation because when we cut down the trees in a particular forest, what we're doing is we are reducing the amount of CO2 that's taken in from the air. So CO2 goes into plants, as you know, by the process of photosynthesis, but if there are less trees that are taking in that CO2, that means there is going to be less of this CO2 taken out of the atmosphere. And as we know, a build-up of CO2 in the atmosphere contributes to global warming, something we'll talk a bit more about in a moment. But not only does it have the effect of reducing the amount of CO2 taken out of the air, but it also adds CO2 into the air. So when we have forests that are cut down or we have deforestation, we have vegetation that has been killed, and that will sit there and rot away. And because it's rotting away, it's through the action of microbes as part of the carbon cycle, which we've talked about. We have an increase in the amount of CO2 that's put into the atmosphere. Also, a lot of the wood can be burned when it's been cut down. If it's not used for anything, it can just simply be burned, and when we burn the wood, that adds CO2 to the atmosphere as well. So you can see we've got two ways in which we're adding CO2 to the atmosphere, and we're reducing the power of the rain, or the ability of the rainforest to be able to remove CO2 from the air. And the CO2 that's released previously was locked away in the wood, in the trees. It was used in the structural material in the tree, so it was kept away from the atmosphere, kept out of the atmosphere. But as it's been burned, all of that has now been released and put into the atmosphere. So that has an overall effect of increasing CO2. Other effects that we have, or other problems that we have, are linked to reducing biodiversity, and we briefly mentioned that in the previous video. Biodiversity is the range of species living in a particular habitat or environment, and when we cut down the trees, we are obviously taking away a living area or a habitat from different species, and we have a massive reduction of the amount of species that can live within a particular area. Now, deforestation isn't done for no reason at all. There is a reason behind actually cutting down the trees, and that is basically for growing, for producing or creating land for growing food crops, or for crops for producing biofuels. And one of the key ones that we mention quite a lot is ethanol. And this can be used for a fuel, and that requires a certain type of crop, or is done best with a certain type of crop, and we can cut away this forest and we can grow the crops that we need. The problem with that is, though, we could be using that for making food, but also we are cutting down large areas of forest, and that's linking to these problems that we've kind of mentioned already. So the key issues with deforestation is this increase in CO2 and also reducing biodiversity by destroying the habitats of living things. Now, CO2, as we know, is a greenhouse gas, but one we don't often mention is called methane. We've come across methane once or twice before, and methane comes from a particular kind of crop called rice. That's one crop that produces methane because we have soil that has lots of water in it, and a particular kind of microorganism grows there, and it produces methane. And as you can imagine, there is a big demand for rice around the world, so a lot of land is used for producing rice, and that land actually, when it's growing rice, produces methane. Another major source of methane is from farming, and in particular livestock. I've got cows here, but it can also be sheep and pigs as well, or certainly sheep. But basically these cows have a digestive process that involves the action of bacteria in their digestive system, and this bacteria produces methane, and the cows obviously have to get rid of that methane. You can see a couple of cows there quite happily enjoying their grass, but also getting rid of the methane that's been produced in their digestive systems. And because we've got so many livestock such as cows that are used for food, there's an increasing population of those, and each releasing a certain amount of methane per particular amount of time. That's going to result in an increase in methane in the atmosphere. Now, something else that is mentioned is peat bogs, and peat bogs are basically areas that are very marshy. So some areas of land are very marshy, and because of that, they contain partially decayed plant material. And this partially decayed plant material is quite useful because it can be burned. It's quite a good fuel, but it's also used to improve the quality of soil. The problem is with it though is when we use it for increasing the quality of soil or we burn it, we release carbon dioxide. So this is yet another way of increasing the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the air. And gardeners and farmers, they use peat in the soil, but there is a movement to try and reduce the amount of peat-based soil, just so that we reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. But you can imagine there's a bit of a reluctance to do that, because obviously they want to grow nice plants and crops and so on, and so it's quite difficult, to get people to stop doing that. Carbon dioxide, as you know, is linked to global warming, and global warming has a particular set of consequences. We have more methane and more CO2 that's put into the atmosphere, as we know, as we just described. This could lead to global warming, and this may cause, now I've highlighted may because we can't be sure that this is what's going to happen, but this may cause a change in climate, rise in sea levels, changes in species distribution, or changes in migration patterns, for example in birds. Rises in sea levels is to do with the melting of the ice caps. Changes in species distribution, well, if there's a particular area that becomes warmer, we might get more species moving into that area as opposed to where they were before, and that could disrupt the environment and food chains and so on. But also an overall change in climate. This stuff really is just for you to know and remember, and that is linked to this idea of global warming. The last thing really I want to just mention quickly is that currently we've got a lot of CO2 that actually dissolves in water, and as you know, most of the planet is covered in water. A lot of CO2 dissolves in that, and we say that the CO2 has been sequestered. That's basically, this word is actually used in the spec, but it just basically means hidden away or locked away in oceans, and this is an important way of reducing the amount of CO2 in the air. But as you know, we are actually increasing the CO2 at quite a rate through deforestation, through burning of fossil fuels in power stations and in cars and so on. Okay, so that's an overview of this idea of global warming and deforestation and what impact it's having. This is basically a lot of stuff you just got to know and remember. There's nothing here that's hugely complicated. It's just stuff that you've got to go over once or twice just so that you have it. But other than that, that's me done. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again soon.